Alrighty, everyone. We're going to start off with a little exercise to see how good you all are at spotting serial killers. Raise your hand if you think that the person or the multiple people depicted in the following slides are serial killers. How about this guy? Or these people? They give off weird vibes. That kid looks pretty serial killer-ish. She's kind of creepy. She is very suspicious. The people circled in red are the serial killers, and this person is actually me as a kid. The individuals in the pictures I showed you are all people, but aside from committing multiple homicides, what makes the people circled in red different? Do they think differently? Do they feel differently? How do their minds work? What made them kill? Hello, my name is Abby Florendo, and welcome to my Masterworks presentation, The Mind of a Killer, a look into the psychology of serial killers. For the longest time, I've had a fascination with darker and more gruesome topics, from listening to disturbing 911 calls late at night to reading various Wikipedia pages depicting the lives of many murderers and serial killers. I've always found them the most interesting. Like, what makes a person kill another person after person after person? What makes them get to that point? Although I find physical aspects of this topic, such as the natures of the different killings, very interesting, I found that the relationship between trauma and psychological development and how their minds work relating to motives and the psychological thrill they receive from killing the most fascinating and intriguing. I hoped that this project would give me a window into the dark minds of some of the most complex people who have lived. Before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge that this presentation discusses and references troubling topics. If at any point you feel uncomfortable or triggered by its contents, please feel free to take a break or leave the presentation. Another thing to note is that I will discuss adverse childhood experiences and trauma and how they may contribute to a serial killer's psychological development. Please in no way think that if you have experienced the same or similar experiences that you will become a serial killer. Cases of these experiences affecting a person's psychology to this degree are extremely rare and infrequent. Firstly, what is a serial killer? A serial killer is an offender who commits the unlawful homicide of two or more victims in separate events. This definition includes criteria that help identify and classify serial killers from other offenders. One of these specifications is that they kill two or more victims. A quote that describes this idea is, "Serial killers kill serially, one murder after another, each a variation and continuation of those before." To be considered a serial killer, an individual needs to kill multiple victims, oftentimes with commonalities and patterns between the natures of the killings. Another thing to take note of is that the killings happen in separate events. This got introduced into the definition in 1988 when the FBI proposed an idea of a cooling off period, which is gaps of time in between instances of killing. This is what differentiates serial killers from mass murderers. Mass murder is the killing of four or more victims in a single event by one or more offenders, lasting for a few minutes or hours. These killings happen in the same event, whereas serial killings happen in different ones with gaps of time in between. What will be covered in this presentation is somewhat divided into two parts: what makes a killer and the killer themselves. We will be first looking at positive and adverse childhood experiences and how they impact psychological development, as well as the relationship between trauma and serial killers. The second part covers the typologies and motivations of serial killers, the psychological thrill that some killers receive from committing these acts, and psychopathy and sociopathy. Throughout the process of writing my Masterworks essay, I looked at the topics of research and compared them to the stories and psychology of 5 serial killers. But for the sake of time and your own mental well-being, I'll only be talking about one: Richard Ramirez. Richard, also known as the Night Stalker, was an American serial killer and rapist who was convicted of 13 murders, which he committed between 1984 and 1985 in Los Angeles and then later in San Francisco. Now that you've all been introduced, we can move on to the rest of the presentation. To get an accurate understanding of serial killers and their psychology, it's best to start at their beginning, their backgrounds, and the roots of the problem and the problematic mind. Not surprisingly, childhoods are one of the most influential periods throughout your lifetime. This is where you start to learn and grow, and your mind will be manipulated by every experience, positive and negative. Part 1, the making, looks at what happens before serial killers become what they are and what factors throughout their childhood shape them into the killers they would become. Positive childhood experiences, or PCEs, are positive events, supportive and uplifting environments, connected and caring relationships, and simple habits throughout childhood that create a sense of belongingness and security. Exposure to PCEs can also implement and demonstrate healthy coping, parenting, and well-being practices. PCEs can be things such as having access to a safe individual to talk to sharing meals with the entire family. Growing up in an environment rich with stability and nurturing relationships has been connected to numerous behavioral benefits in adulthood, such as a reduced risk of severe depression as well as lower levels of stress. PCEs were also found to influence parenting styles, and individuals who grew up in supporting households and experienced positive coping strategies from their parents were more likely to use these strategies when they were older and had families of their own. Basically, children observe and learn how to cope with stress in healthy ways and create good relationships with people from their parents and use that knowledge when they are older. Overall, aside from creating happy childhood memories, PCEs are extremely influential on a child's positive psychological development. Then there are the childhood experiences which are not so loving and caring, called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. ACEs are traumatic incidents that transpire throughout an individual's childhood and can have negative repercussions that influence the individual and their well-being throughout the remainder of their lives. These experiences can be things such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, domestic violence, physical and/or emotional neglect, growing up around substance abuse or having a household member dealing with addictions, divorce or death of parents or caretakers, having an incarcerated household member, as well as normalization and extreme modeling of violent and criminal behaviors. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go into too much detail for them, except for one, which also connects to Richard: the normalization and extreme modeling of violent and criminal behaviors. Spending time with an individual that introduces criminal behaviors and violent practices can promote similar tendencies through normalization. This means that the child may learn and use that these behaviors are normal and okay and act in similar ways. So, how does this connect to Richard? Richard's involvement with violent endeavors started way back when he was a young boy. Around the age of 12, Richard started becoming very close to one of his cousins who was an old Vietnam War veteran. This cousin proved to be a less than ideal role model for the young Richard. Richard's cousin would spend time with him smoking and showing him explicit photographs that he took during his time in Vietnam. These photographs depicted images of Richard's cousin's victims from the war. On top of that, one time Richard witnessed his cousin killing his wife by shooting her. That seems like a really traumatic event for a young boy to witness. Even though Richard's cousin's actions weren't directly abusive towards Richard, they still ended up impacting him in ways such as normalizing these violent acts. Something to note is that not everyone who experiences one or more ACEs will be impacted in such prominent ways. Childhood trauma does have an impact on people's psychological development, but only in rare cases is it so extreme as to create a serial killer. Just because you've had the same or similar experiences doesn't mean you will be a serial killer. In some cases, serial killers are in no way the victim of ACEs, but correlations between adverse childhood experiences and serial killers cannot be brushed off as a coincidence. Serial killers have some kind of breakage within them and their minds that push them to commit horrendous acts, and traumatic events during childhood could be a factor in creating these breakages. One of the ways ACEs can affect a developing mind is they can influence psychological and psychosocial mechanisms. This can look like hindrances in cognitive and affective processes, increase in aggressive behaviors, deeper and more frequent feelings of loneliness, heightened attention and reactions towards threats, and stronger senses of survival at all costs, as well as effects in social cognitive functions within interactions and forming connected relationships. A lot of these behaviors are readily observed in serial killers. ACEs also have an effect on the physical brain, and many neurological alterations have been found relating to individuals who have experienced them. One of the main sections of the brain affected by ACEs is the amygdala. This region of the brain usually deals with awareness relating to reactivity to threats and danger, as well as emotional responses and processes. People who have had ACEs can develop dysfunctional behaviors within processes that occur in the amygdala. These dysfunctional behaviors can be described as a heightened reactivity to the processing of stimuli and danger, as well as an increase in aggression. Connections between adverse childhood experiences and violence exhibited later in life has also been readily observed. One cause of this could be the cycle of violence, where individuals who had a deep history with ACEs and forms of violence during childhood have a higher risk of exhibiting violence and criminal behaviors later in life. This topic of the cycle of violence was discussed by Joel Norris within his book, Serial Killers. He expressed that parents who abuse their children physically as well as psychologically instill them in an almost instinctive reliance upon violence as a first resort to any challenge. Children who experience violence and abuse during childhood learn to use violence as a way to control and deal with their issues and challenges. All of the ways of how ACEs affect psychological development described so far are all behavioral changes, where the ACEs change how the individual acts, which can be in ways that can be associated with serial killers and can promote criminal behaviors. But experiencing traumatic incidents within childhood probably alters the serial killer's psychological development and creates breakages in unknown ways and not just in behavioral ones. Another theory that correlates childhoods and serial killers is the McDonald triad. The idea of the McDonald triad is that there are 3 childhood behaviors that can indicate whether someone will grow up to be a serial killer. The concepts of the McDonald triad started gaining recognition in 1963 following the publication of the psychiatrist John McDonald's article, The Threat to Kill. This article discussed correlations between the exhibition of 3 childhood behaviors and violent tendencies later in life. The 3 behaviors included in the McDonald triad are animal cruelty, fire setting, and enuresis, or bedwetting. These practices aren't considered adverse childhood experiences, but they do have connections to them. These signs may not be just indicators of if someone will be a serial killer, but they're indicators of abuse experienced in childhood. The first behavior included in the McDonald triad is animal cruelty. The believed reason for animal cruelty displayed in a serial killer's adolescence is that the behavior came from a place of abuse experienced by the child. This can be forms of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse that an older individual enacted on the child and which the child couldn't retaliate against. Animal cruelty practices could be due to the child's experienced abuse and the environment where they cannot do anything about it, and instead act out their frustrations on animals to vent their anger on something weaker and more defenseless. Being able to have the feeling of control over the animals and the environment can act as a substitute to having the power of retaliation and taking violent initiative against an abuser. Another reason for animal cruelty could be the normalization of violence and how the child thinks that violence is empowering, and thus they seek out violent practices which can present as animal cruelty. Fire setting is the second behavior in the McDonald triad. Similarly to the believed reasons for a child to demonstrate animal cruelty, it has been suggested that fire setting is another way that aggression, helplessness, and other feelings of no control relating to abuse can be released. Even though fire starting doesn't always involve the harm of a living creature, it still gives the feelings of visibly gaining control and satisfies the unresolved feelings of aggression sparked by childhood abuse. The third and final component of the McDonald triad is frequent bedwetting or enuresis. Bedwetting is associated with humiliation, shame, and embarrassment, and it can be connected to stress and anxiety, which can continue and heighten the behaviors. The stress and anxiety expressed from bedwetting can be a factor of violence and abuse within the childhood or within the household, or bullying experienced in school. Even though the theory of the McDonald triad may not be 100% accurate, this hasn't hindered researchers and psychologists to observe and notice links between the behaviors and serial killers. Now that we know a little bit about what can affect a serial killer's psychological development, we can look at the killers themselves and their minds. Why do they kill? What motivates them? Why do some feel a thrill and gratification from killing? What is psychopathy? These are some of the things that are going to be covered in part 2 of this presentation, the mind. Even though serial killers have many defining features, they also have similarities and can be separated into 4 loose typologies based on their motivations: the power and control, the mission-oriented, the visionary, and the hedonistic. The first typology is power and control, and like the name suggests, killers within this category's main motive is to gain control and have the satisfaction, gain power and have the satisfaction of complete control. These killers thrive and find fulfillment in being in a position of total dominance over their victims, and they feel a strong need to force their victims into positions of helplessness, and in doing so, make the killer feel utterly in control of the situation. Throughout the whole process, power and control killers find enjoyment in tormenting their victims and getting inside their heads, from causing them distress to being physically overpowering. The act of killing itself, among other things, can be empowering for the killer due to their position and capability to decide how, when, why, and the other circumstances around their victim's death. The next typology is the mission-oriented. Serial killers that fall in this typology mainly kill for reasons such as seeking revenge, financial gain, or eliminating a specific group of people. Mission-oriented serial killers often have a level of hatred towards a certain group of individuals, and their victims and who they target usually fall within this group. Mission-oriented killers rationalize in their mind that this killing is necessary due to their mentality that the world would be a better place without these individuals, and that it's their duty to rid the world of them. Some groups that can be targets for mission-oriented killers are prostitutes and sex workers, the homeless, and people who are distinctive from the killer in ways such as race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and religion. Some mission-oriented killers feel like it's their duty to eradicate the members of the chosen community and that they are chosen by a higher power to do so. Visionary killers in some ways are similar to mission-oriented killers in the aspect that there's a higher power guiding them towards committing these acts. Yet, there remain differences between the two. Visionary killers usually suffer from some kind of psychosis, including hallucinations and delusions, and they feel compelled or commanded to carry out killings by the judgment of imaginary voices, supernatural beings, or entities. Visionary killers are not told to target a certain group of people by these voices. They are just told to kill. The last typology is hedonistic. Serial killers that fall within this category kill primarily and most commonly for lust and sexual pleasure and gratification. Due to the fulfillment found within carrying out these acts, many hedonistic killers feel like they need to continue these forms of stimulation, which shows in repeatedly killing and feeling like they cannot stop. Similarly to forms of addiction, hedonistic killers get addicted to the gratification provided from rape, other sexual activities, and murder. Richard falls into two typologies, visionary and hedonistic. Richard could be a visionary killer due to his claims that a certain entity made him follow through with the killings, but he could also be hedonistic due to his tendency to rape his victims. As discussed, serial killers kill for many different reasons, but one of which is undoubtedly extremely fascinating and intriguing. Serial killers who kill for this reason belong in the hedonistic killer typology, but further discussion about them is needed to fully understand the absurd motivation for their actions. These killers are the individuals that kill for pleasure, gratification, and excitement that they receive from carrying out these acts. Similarly to the adrenaline rush some people require from doing daring activities, such as riding roller coasters, these killers acquire the same feelings from killing their victims. It's hard to comprehend that an individual can receive gratification and enjoyment from killing, and there are no explanations for this. They find pleasure in doing it, so they do it. They can obtain these feelings throughout the process and not just the murder itself. This can present as stalking their victims and the idea of the hunt. Peter Vronsky discussed this topic in his book, Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters. He states that these killers derive intense satisfaction from the process of murder, that is, the acts leading up to it, rather than the killing itself. These killers find excitement and enjoyment in tormenting and getting inside their victims' heads and or anticipating the thrill they will receive from killing throughout the before-killing processes in ways such as stalking. Some of these killers fantasize about the killings they are about to or have committed, wanting to relieve the rush from past killings or imagining the feelings of excitement they will receive. On the idea of reliving the experience, some killers connect souvenirs, trophies, and tokens from their victims, which can refuel and sustain their violent fantasies. John Douglas, a former FBI profiler, states that keeping mementos from a victim, such as a lock of hair, jewelry, ID card, or a newspaper clipping from the crime, helps prolong and even nurse the serial killer's secret fantasy. Similarly to how some of you may collect postcards or mementos from vacation destinations you have visited to remember the fun times you've had there. Psychopathy is a personality disorder that can be defined as insufficient emotional reactions and responses, an increase or abundance in antisocial tendencies, faulty behavior and impulse controls, and an absence of empathy, which can result in the individual committing criminal offenses and, in this case, ending people's lives. There is a wide spectrum of psychopathy, but individuals and violent offenders who have severe psychopathic tendencies are able to commit crimes and killings without concern about emotional, legal, moral, or social consequences. Psychopathy has been a topic researched and discussed, and as well as its connections to violent offenders. And for a while, psychopathic was something that somebody could or couldn't be. In 1991, with the development and finalizing of Robert D. Hare's Hare Psychopathy Checklist, the idea of a spectrum of psychopathy was suggested and publicized. The Hare Psychopathy Checklist focuses on the lifestyle, tendencies, and personality traits of an individual, and then assesses the extent and presence of psychopathy within them. There are 22 questions, and the individual answers if the traits are definitely present, possibly present, or definitely absent, which corresponds to a marking out of 2, 1, and 0. The markings are then added up to a score out of 44. The higher the person scores, the more psychopathic the person is. All right, we need a volunteer. Scott? All right, so I will say a certain trait or behavior, and you'll answer if you think that the behavior is definitely present, possibly present, or definitely absent in you. All right, impulsivity.
Possibly.
Proneness to boredom.
Definitely absent.
Lack of empathy.
Definitely absent.
Short-tempered and/or poor behavioral controls.
Possibly present.
And irresponsible behavior as a parent.
Definitely absent.
All right, so out of these 5 questions, you have a score of 2 out of a possible score of 10. And looking at your answers, it seems like you have very few psychopathic tendencies. So Richard here got 31 out of 44, which is pretty high and indicates the presence of psychopathic symptoms. There is no confirmed cause for psychopathy, but many factors have been suggested, such as genetics, brain structure and development, and interestingly, trauma and exposure to adverse childhood experiences. This idea of correlations between trauma and psychopathy has been researched, and findings showed that violent offenders who experience adverse childhood experiences generally scored higher on the Hare Psychopathy Checklist and had a greater tendency of developing psychopathic symptoms. Now, before anyone asks me this, what are the differences between psychopathy and sociopathy? Both terms have almost identical definitions, but both have some slight differences. Individuals that are considered sociopaths generally struggle more with trying to keep up jobs and family lives and forming connected relationships, while on the flip side, psychopaths struggle less with this. In addition, sociopaths can experience more guilt than psychopaths due to a psychopath's tendency to disassociate from their actions. As well, sociopaths tend to act more impulsively and erratically compared to psychopaths. So, what happened to Richard? After leaving a shoe print at his last crime scene, Richard's name, photo, and identity were made public on August 30th, 1985. Soon after, a witness spotted him and notified the police. Once the police knew his whereabouts, they quickly chased him down until he stopped to steal a car, but then he was surrounded by a crowd and was beaten and restrained until the police arrived. Trials and legal proceedings ensued, and in 1989, he was convicted of 13 murders. Richard was sentenced to death, but while being on death row, he got diagnosed with cancer and passed away in 2013. During his interrogation and ride to the police station, Richard confessed to the murders, but then pleaded not guilty during his trials. To know the amount of serial killers that exist and have existed is a task considered impossible. Nobody knows or will know the exact number of people who have committed these acts, and all records and numbers will always be an underestimate. What we do know is that these people do exist, and that their numbers may fluctuate depending on various influences, such as advances in forensic technology. There are no ways to describe serial killers as a whole. Serial killers are complicated beings with a lot of their psychology and thought processes unknown. Oftentimes, they are products of their environment and victims of childhood adversity. They're all unique and have motives and justifications for their actions. They can exist on the spectrum of psychopathy. Through this project, I was able to gain better insight on serial killers as people and not just killers. I was able to look beyond the bloody murder and see the serial killers for who they were before, during, and after they committed these killings. I better understand their motives, minds, and how most of them were products of their environment. Knowing their horrendous childhoods and functions of their mind won't excuse them from their actions, but serial killers are so much more than a cold killer holding a blood-dripping knife. I would like to say thank you to my external advisor, Brian Thomas Peter. Your knowledge surrounding the topic and amazing feedback helped immensely and is much appreciated. Mom, also known as Carrie Marintet, thank you so much for working with me on this presentation. All your editing, ideas, and feedback helped immensely. It helped keep me on track and made my writing so much better. When we were doing our declarations of interest and saying which teacher we wanted to be our internal advisor, even though I said I didn't have a preference, I was hoping I'd get you. I'm so glad I got to do this with you. Jen, you're my third mom and the mom of the entire grade 9 class. Your diligence with keeping us all on track and meeting our deadlines while being the Masterworks advisor for 3 kids while organizing Masterworks is extremely impressive. Thank you so much for all your help this year. Also, happy belated birthday. Thank you to my parents for leaving me alone and letting me work when I needed to, as well as listening to me practice my presentation. Thank you to my close friends and others for listening to me yap so much about all these serial killers, as well as looking over some of my work and giving your amazing opinions and making it so much better. And thank you all for coming to my presentation. This is an extremely hard topic, and your bravery and attendance is much appreciated. I had to laugh so hard. Check
2. This is where I know where we gather ourselves. I want you all to know that Abby wrote a very long, very intense, and super well-researched paper. There's a lot of information, and honestly, it was like reading a university-level psychology paper. So I am very proud of the presentation that you put together, that it touches on a lot of really sensitive topics, but was very easy to digest and looked at it through a psychological lens and not through any kind of a lens that would not treat them as humans. So thank you for that. I think you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
And are you ready for some questions?
Yep.
So we're going to go to your advisory team first to ask the first questions.
Sure. So great job, Ms. Florendo. That was amazing. It's been a pleasure working with you throughout this whole process. So crying too. I do have a question for you. So like Jen said, this is quite an intense topic. And I'm wondering how throughout this process did you find it might have impacted your mental well-being, and how did you manage or mitigate that along the way?
Yeah, it was kind of like intense at some points. Like those of you who have read my paper, you know that I looked at some pretty nasty things, and like sometimes while reading that it was like a lot, but like I guess like how to like manage that is like not focusing on it, and like because like there's so much like other things to focus on, so like spending time with people you like enjoy being with, or like doing things you like, just to not like focus on all the nasty things.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks very much for the presentation. I thought you did a great job
Thank you.
summarizing so much work and so much effort that you've made. I particularly like what your reply to this last question, in which you suggested how the mitigation of the challenges of almost trauma that you experience reading these days. Well, that was very interesting that you deliberately spent time with people that would repair that damage. So good on you. That was really good of you to do. The question I have is, you had this interest for a very long time, and I'd be very interested to know how this research has impacted your understanding of people who have done very bad things.
I definitely got to know more about them. Like, I was really interested in like very like physical aspects of it and like what they did, but like with this project I got to look more on like who they were, which like that gave me a better understanding about like them and like why they would do this and not like just what they did. And like my perspective on like what was interesting to learning, like what to learn about was also like changed as well. Like I was very interested in like I said, what they did, but with this, like there's so many other interesting things to learn about, and instead of reading nasty ways of how they hurt people, we can learn about like them and like their childhoods and like that kind of thing, and like all these little complexities.
Some questions from the floor. We'll go with long number one.
I wanted to know if there was information on Richard Ramirez's history as a child relating to the McDonald triad. Without getting into details, did he show instances of animal cruelty and setting fires, and was he bedridden?
Okay, not with this Richard, but another Richard I looked at demonstrated animal cruelty within his childhood, and unfortunately I didn't include him in this presentation, but I couldn't find anything for the Richard I did include relating to that.
Thank you.
Ms. Parker, can you come up with the mic?
Great presentation, Ms. Florendo. I was wondering why do you think people are interested in like films depicting horror or like violence?
Okay, I actually looked at this in my paper, like a very short section, but a few things I did find, like there was like two main believed reasons, and one of which was it was like instinctual, like kind of like how like some prey may observe their predators, like people like observe serial killers to learn about them. And then another one was just like people just find it interesting and like enjoy that kind of like stimulation and like engagement and that kind of thing. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think this was something also for me when I was reading it, because everyone has a different tolerance level and a different interest level for that sort of dark side of humanity. And my tolerance is really, really low. So reading Abby's paper, Ms. Florendo's paper, was really difficult for me. And for you, I know you were drawn to it, and for your own recreation, you're looking into these things. So everyone has a different tolerance, but you're right. I feel like this draw that people have towards darker parts of humanity is something that's maybe because we are barraged with social media and TV shows and all of that crime shows and focusing on murderers seems to have gained a lot of popularity. So it's, I think, really refreshing right now to hear that instead of the gory details, we're actually hearing the psychology of how those people are in the world, because their realities are different. So, great question, Ms. Parker. Brad, come on up.
Thank you, Mrs. Florendo. I'm trying to think how this goes going down, because I remember when my daughter came home and said, I'm going to do my Masterworks on fair trade coffee. And then your daughter comes home, I want to study serial killing, right? But you must be very proud, like what an amazing, brave thing. Not only just because this is a dark space, but you were willing to look at things that most of us don't like to look at. And do that in a very mature, kind of professional way, I think. And because we need to do that. We can't sort of stick our heads in the sand. And we need people who are willing to look at those things and tell us about them. We've sort of been talking, I guess, about the psychology of serial killers, but I'm really interested, and if you don't have an answer right now, that's fine, but I'm interested in what was that experience for you to have kind of a morbid fascination. We all do, but that's why we like those horror movies and that kind of thing. But what was it like to have just a fascination and then go through a really disciplined, rigorous study of something? How does that change you in some way? Do you approach these things differently? Can you tell us a bit about your experience?
Well, it was kind of like I did have to approach this differently, especially with like the presentation, because like I couldn't say a lot of the things that I researched like in the presentation, which was really hard. But like it was hard to like, because I had like so much, and then I had to like very like refine it and like kind of like water it down a lot, and that was like hard because like I want to talk about it, it's really interesting, but like not everybody wants to hear that. like that was also hard with like other like people not wanting to hear it, like friends or just like other people around me probably don't want to hear about gruesome things that I've just been like yapping about a lot.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a big responsibility to take on, do all that work, and then have to decide for us, keep us safe, while still answering some really important questions. So thank you very much. I'm inspired. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor?
I don't have a question, Abby. Your presentation was, sorry, Ms. Florendo, your presentation was so informative, but maybe just a little bit of an echo to what Brad said. I just really honor your boldness and your courage to share this. For me, I found it very academic and very informative, and kind of connecting back to what Jen said, we get bombarded with a lot of things through the media, and we never have the background that you provided today. And I think that's really enriching to me as a human being, to have that deep academic background to these psychoses that exist out there within the human family that we all exist in. And I think that the work that you did as a grade 9 student this year is formative to us being better as a society, because we have to drill into this stuff. We have to know and understand, and I just want to applaud you for sharing that
Thank
today.
you.
We have a question from Ms. Parker, and then
Sorry, another question. I was wondering, like, after doing this project, do you have more, like, empathy for serial killers?
A little bit. Like they did, like a lot of them have like really messed up childhoods and had like a lot of messed up like things happen to them, but then they went on and did a lot of messed up things. So I feel like I have empathy towards them as children, but then after that, not so much.
And of course we must ask, so after doing this project, can you see yourself pursuing any sort of further work on this topic or in this field, or potentially as a career in your future?
Potentially, like it's really interesting and I find it very interesting, and there's a lot of different like jobs like within the area that would be fun to explore, but we'll see.